Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Laasch, and I'm the author of the textbook Principles of Management, Practicing Ethics, Responsibility, and Sustainability. This is a very short introduction to the topic of sustainable management, which is one of the chapters of that book, which is openly available here on YouTube, but which I have produced in particular on the kind invitation of my dear colleague Fodhla at Ulster University. So let's get right into it. Here we go. So this is the textbook which I just mentioned. It's chapter 5 on sustainable management. On purpose, as you will notice later on, I didn't call it sustainability management because I think those are two related but quite different things. So we're going to get there a little bit later on. What do we mean with sustainable management? I think a very good idea to start answering that question, or a very good way to do so, is to look at a case that gives us an iconic impression of what sustainable management could look like. So this is about the company Interface Floor. Maybe you have heard about them because they have been discussed quite a lot, because they have been such important pioneers in sustainable management. You might have heard recently about things like not mission zero, but net zero emissions, which many companies are engaging right now because of the climate change issue that we are all have to tackle at the moment, and for quite a long time still. But even more than 25 years ago, in 1994, Interface Floor actually had their mission zero, and their CEO back then, CEO and founder Ray Anderson, he actually was inspired by a book he read back then about how all of our industrial production and our economic system is unsustainable. It cannot sustain the consumption that we produce by it cannot be sustained by our planet, which means that our society, our human race, cannot be sustained by the planet. So he said, well, what we have to do in order to become sustainable is to move towards a zero sum in terms of the impact that we have on the planet. So at least we shouldn't harm the planet. Maybe there's even something that we could call a planetary restoration. So maybe we can find a way of managing in certain sectors and certain companies, and ideally in the majority of sectors and companies, that actually restores the planet and does not just draw from its resources. But at the very least, we should move on to net zero, or mission zero, as they said. So this then, of course, entails many different things. I could kind of rattle down the list of different things that Interface Floor and the managers at Interface Floor have done. But it all boils down to one really important metric, and this is the triple bottom line. And the triple bottom line moves away from the idea that we have one bottom line, just only the economic or financial bottom line, and towards the idea that we do have a social and an environmental bottom line as well. It's not a completely straightforward idea, or it's not an undisputed idea, but I think it's an idea that really helps us to align our thinking and to find out what we have to do to get there. So this is the ultimate metric. And John Elkington, who coined the term the triple bottom line in a really interesting book called Cannibals with Forks. So that's us cannibals with forks, eating up our own planet, but doing so in a very sophisticated, very educated way. So he was saying that actually this triple bottom line should be kind of the genetic code, the underlying code of management of the future, of a sustainable future. And this happened just in 1997. So it is a couple of years ago, but it's not too long ago. And it looks like we're slowly actually moving towards managing in this way. And this is what I mean with sustainable management. Actually, not the management of sustainability. So it's not about the situation where you're a specialized environmental manager. No, it's about sustainable management overall. It's about everybody's job and to make that sustainable. This is the idea. Good. And this is what I just said. So the idea is that sustainable management can actually balance and sustain social, environmental, and economic capital in the short, in the medium, and in the long run. And this is really important. I'm gonna move forward quite a bit, because I think this one here expresses that idea very well. So that's what I mean with balancing and sustaining. So we do have those 3 types of capital, so those 3 types of resources, natural resources, social human resources, although I don't like the word human resources, and economic, commercial, financial resource. And it's not only that we have to balance out how much we use of all of them, but we also have to find out how we can sustain all of them in the long run, and to sustain all of them in parallel, so that we don't use up one and actually are far ahead on the others. That's the idea of balancing and sustaining. But let's move all the way back once again. So sustainable management is something that we cannot achieve on our own as managers in the economic sector. It actually does need other sectors as well. It means governments that make laws and run countries in which sustainability is actually possible, provide certain infrastructures, not only of the legal, but also of the physical kind, normative infrastructures, but also social institutions, infrastructure in terms of our social hardware that our life and our managerial activities is embedded into. And then, of course, it also needs the civil society sector. And I don't only mean civil society in the sense of NGOs or civil society organizations, but it needs every one of us in our private lives as well. But again, having said that, although we do need all of those three sectors, we actually, as managers, and this is what this box over here is about, can do a lot. And the idea is that although it sounds like a very big task, the kind of basic nuts and bolts of it are quite simple. So we have to assess impacts, and we have managed impacts, so social, environmental, economic impacts. And we have to do that in a way that the triple bottom line balances itself out, and we don't use up any of the capital. So on that end, doesn't sound like rocket science, right? But it is really, really complex, because we have to do it in that context that we're living in, which is an enormously complex context. So think about it. How do you, for instance, balance your impacts across a long supply chain, where you often don't even know who's having what kind of impact? How do you, if regulations in different countries are completely different, how do you even know what you can and can't do in one country or another? You cannot just roll it out. How do you actually assess different impacts? So how would you even compare social, environmental, and economic impacts? You could monetize them all and just put a dollar sign on them. But then again, what's worth $1? What worth does one ton of CO2 have, for instance? Well, that's an arbitrary assessment. So it gets really, really complex there. But how did we actually get there? This is a big question, important question. And I think there have been quite a number of historic moves that have gotten us into this mess, brought us into that unsustainable situation, and have shaped the type of unsustainable management that we're still dominantly doing at the moment. And in my perspective, it actually starts with colonialism. So the idea that whenever we're running out of resources in our country, we can just go somewhere else and grab somebody else's resources. Great. So that leads us into the idea of abundance, which is really, really problematic. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden you can actually produce large amounts of products at a relatively low price. So it makes consumption, and consumption being very environmentally unsustainable to the degree that we have it right now. So making excessive consumption and cheap consumption, that's something that is possible. And with it will obviously coming all of the emissions that you create through consumptions, all of the waste, everything that we're struggling with right now. And then in the second industrial revolution, it was really about how do we move things in a way that is more efficient, we would say back then. But really that way of moving by train, by steamboat, later by cars, all of those are built on non-renewable resources. So yes, welcome climate change. This is where much of our CO2 emissions nowadays still come. Well, obviously a lot of this energy production in general as well, but fuels do play quite a big role. And then we had something that a little bit misleadingly is called the Green Revolution. So this doesn't mean green in the sense of more sustainable. It means green in the sense of agricultural revolution. So this is the massive use of pesticides, of chemicals, agrochemicals in general, but also of fertilizers, but also machine heavy machine use in agriculture, which allows to increase volumes a lot and obviously to drive the prices of food down. But at the same time, that kind of often monoculture-based agriculture, and in recent years, often the issues with genetically modified food, potential issues with it, actually are extremely unsustainable. So this is where all of our food system became unsustainable. And then finally, well, hopefully there's something on the way right now, and it looks like it is happening, that we actually do have a sustainability revolution where all of the things that we as human beings do, if we want to survive as a species, have to become sustainable. We see things popping up which are very large scale. So this whole move to zero emissions, or net zero emissions rather, kind of the big climate discussions overall, legislation phasing out fossil fused vehicles. So it looks like things are on the move, but we're still very, very far away from actually having those issues fixed. And it's not surprising, because if you see how long back those issues range, so when they were actually institutionalized, when they were built into our humanity, obviously this is not something you can undo in a year or two. This needs decades, and it probably will need at least half a century if we get there, that we can live a sustainable life. And it is often very grotesque, even because now you're trying Cargill's, for instance, which is one of the biggest food producers in the world, does some things right. So they're saying we're using science-based targets to restore water reserves. So you would say, yeah, restorative management. But at the same time, you're still doing it in the same kind of monoculture system that actually has done so much damage, and which blocks out large plots of lands. So land use is one of the main issues we have in sustainability, change of land use, and crowding out of natural ecosystems. So you're basically making something unsustainable just a little bit better. So even though sometimes it looks like the right thing is being done, it's actually not far enough, and sometimes it even reinforces the issues that we already have in place, unfortunately. And if you're a numbers person, you will probably like this. So this is about Earth Overshoot Day. So the day in the year where we have used up our natural resources. And in the past, well, in the not so distant past, in the 1960s still, we actually were able to use just one Earth a year. But now the problem, but then if you look at 1971 down there, 1970, 1971, for the first times, actually, your Earth Overshoot Day would move further into the year. So you would actually use up your Earth that you should be, I mean, the resources of your Earth that you should be using within that 1 year, using them up earlier. And this is a problem. So for instance, if you look at 2019, which is the last year in this graph, well, already in August, we had used up our Earth, which means that basically per year we're using 1.75 Earth. So overall, we almost would need 2 planets in order to satisfy our needs. I don't even want to call it needs, to satisfy our consumption wants. And this obviously isn't sustainable. So because while we're doing that, we're actually reducing the capacity of Earth to sustain us, because every time we're using more than the Earth produces on an annual basis, we're reducing the output of the global ecosystem for the next year. So not only that we're using more than we should, but also we're actually reducing the capacity that sustains us on this planet. And this is a really, really big problem. So this can lead us to many different scenarios. The one we usually talk about, the negative scenario, is the lose-lose scenario down here. Society loses, environment loses. So we're using up all of the resources and society breaks down. We're basically going back into the medieval dark ages, wars everywhere, no solid kind of institutional structures that keep states in place. Famines, just kind of niche of people surviving. So kind of really a kind of end time scenario. And well, the other one would be a win-win scenario where actually you have equitable sustainability. So if we are able to make those very, very strong moves, we might be able to get to a situation where we actually have enough resources on that planet to have everybody who wants to live on that planet do so in an environmentally even way, so in a way where we don't use up more than the Earth can give us. But then also we have other scenarios, and in a way, this eco-colonialism scenario is the one that we're right now are in. Although we're not at the end point, but at least in this part of the journey, this is where we are. But it's just about to change. So, for instance, for a long, long time, many of the Western countries have been shipping their waste, particularly the recyclable waste, over to other countries. So, for instance, China has been one of the main countries taking on a lot of the industrial waste that we in Western countries were producing, but that stopped a couple of years ago. They said we won't have it anymore, and many other countries have done the same thing. So this kind of eco-colonialism, where you're outsourcing your own negative impact to somebody else, well, that's stopping right now as well. So the question is, where do we go from here? Good. And then the question, where do we go from here? How do we do that? I think this donut model is actually very helpful, because it gives us an idea about the kind of the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, both of which we have to take care of. So if you look over here, this dark green is the social foundation down here, and the ecological ceiling is that one over here. So the social foundation means if we want to have that social and environmentally sustainable existence on Earth, we have to make sure that the basic needs of people are met. So we need to have food, we need to have health, education, income and work, peace and justice, and so on. But at the same time, we need to achieve this in a way that actually doesn't go beyond our ecological ceiling. So that doesn't go beyond the planetary boundaries that we have and the carrying capacity of the planet. So it means it cannot contribute to ocean acidification. Wow, complicated word. To a degree where we actually reduce the biological capacity of the ocean. We have to neutralize, or we have to stop, to halt climate change. We have to make sure chemical pollution doesn't get beyond the levels that allow our life on Earth in the long run, and so on. So this is the ecological ceiling, and actually one of the most severe ones, or often what we hear, the next big crisis will come from biodiversity loss, where our ecosystems collapse. And well, we are still part of nature. We are not something some kind of godlike creature. Kind of hovering in the air above everything and disconnected. No, if biodiversity loss, respectively a biodiversity collapse happens, our food supplies disappear. Well, our food sources disappear, because still most of the food we eat somehow ties back into some ecosystem. And if the biodiversity collapse leads to partial ecosystem collapse, well, we are in big problems. Good. So let's talk a little bit more about the conceptual foundations of sustainable management. I want to move a little bit quicker still, because I think we want to get to the juicy discussion at the end of the session. So, but I think something very important to keep in mind is that definition of sustainable development, because it can serve as a really good guidance. So a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations usually have behind it. So this is called the Brundtland definition, because it came out of the Brundtland Commission, which in the 1980s, late 1980s, for the first time made this term of sustainable development explicit as part of a major report. So this then means sustainability is where we are able to sustain the situation, or at least to sustain some situation that's livable for human beings. And there's a couple of really good visualizations, frameworks, which I really like and which are very helpful. So the simplest one is probably the one in the middle, where you're saying, well, sustainable development only works if we are actually able to balance out those three pillars, which we talked about before: economic, social, and environmental. But then while we're balancing them out, the right one comes into play. So we have to do that in a way where the economy is in a way smaller than society, because the economy can only produce as much as society consumes. But you can also not just boost societal consumption endlessly, because there's, as we've seen before, an environmental outer frontier that you can't go beyond. So you only have one planet that you can live off. So also society can't get too big, and our consumption in society can't get too big. So obviously an economy and management practice that is geared towards endless growth cannot live on a planet. So it's really easy to see it on something like this. So how on earth do we all, or do many of us, believe that endless growth actually works economically? It's crazy. And then you can also think about the left Venn diagram, which I find very helpful. I'm not going to go into depth there, but what it does is to let you think about what are different scenarios. So what happens if I'm actually socially and economically sustainable? Well, in a way, you probably have an equitable development, and people have sometimes claimed China has an equitable development because the kind of spoils of war, and I mean economic war competition here, apparently are being relatively equally distributed in that new Chinese middle class coming up. So that's something we might call equitable. But at the same time, if the environmental dimension is missing, as it still is in many Chinese cities in particular, you've got a different kind of problem. So really badly polluted air, for instance, rivers with many species extinct. So for instance, the Yangtze River dolphin was extinct a couple of years ago in that quest for equitable development that's socially and economically balanced out. So we need to take care of all three. This is the idea, and we can use that one to think through what that might look like. And then there's different fundamental positions in sustainability, and we often call them weak and strong sustainability. So weak sustainability is somebody who tells you, well, yeah, I mean, we're very innovative, like human beings are super clever, we're resilient, we can adapt and solve problems. So yeah, once the shit hits the fan, we're just gonna fix it. We're just gonna clean it up. No worries. That's the one. And in that one, often you also have the argument that, well, you can actually be entirely sustainable in the current economic system. So we don't have to make big systemic changes. It doesn't have to be radical change. We just have to tweak it around a little bit. But particularly in the last couple of years, more and more people have come to the realization that this tweaking around will not do. And this is where strong sustainability comes in. So if you're thinking, for instance, about like the earlier Occupy Wall Street movements going against the financial systems unsustainable, or much more recent Extinction Rebellions activities, or Fridays for the Future, all of those are actually calls for system change. So strong sustainability seems to be what many have become to realize is the way how we have to go if we take this seriously and if we want to survive as a species. Good. And we have many different ways of how we can do that, and one of the main tools or frameworks that's helpful is the footprinting idea. So the footprint is how deeply do I sink in a way. So how much resources me as a human being, or as me being a company or a nation or whole humanity do I have? So what you've seen before in terms of the World Overshoot Day was using that footprinting idea already. So what we know then is we are unsustainable if that footprint is actually more than one. So the idea that we're using up more than corresponds to us. But what does that actually mean? So here I've got an example, and this is on a nation level. So how many Earth do we need if the world's population would live like blah, blah, blah country? So it's a little bit small here, but I can tell you that, for instance, over here we've got the winner, or rather big loser for the planet, which is Qatar. You see down here, one Earth would be about this size. So they must be using up probably 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times the planet. So if everybody was living like Qatar, well, our global impact would even be much worse, our global footprint. But then again, if you look at Ireland, for instance, this is Ireland. So still, it doesn't look as bad, but it's probably still 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 in terms of the overall volume of that. Or my own country, Germany, is probably much worse. Where's Germany? cannot see it at the moment. There's the Netherlands, Germany here. Yeah, so we are still a little bit consumption heavier than Ireland. But then also you have many of the developing countries, particularly African countries, which are actually far below that one footprint. So they are saving us in a way. But again, economic development, if we do get it wrong, and we've been getting it wrong for a long time, also for those countries will mean economic success once again means earth failure and problems that we have to solve. So this means it's really up to all of us, not only in terms of our private lives like those folks did. So they actually used for their wedding in probably the most difficult times of running a wedding during COVID, high times of COVID, they were using those visors that look like they're made of plastic, but they're actually not. So you can actually get very unique fixes and you can get it done. But the point here is it is strong sustainability. It's not something that works in a way where you just tweak things around a little bit. So even that visor tweak here probably won't do it. We need to go much further. For instance, to rethink what does it mean to have a wedding, maybe even to not have in-person weddings of too many people if people have to travel very far because of the CO2 impact of overseas travel, for instance. So rethinking things, that's the point. But the orientation for rethinking really is that triple bottom line that we already talked about before. And often we hear someone, some company or some community or a particular product or a person is claiming to be sustainable. But what does that actually mean? I would actually say that probably 90% of the time somebody says that, it's on very thin ice. So let's look at a more nuanced way of understanding what sustainability means. So we might have different types of management, for instance. The best one would be restorative management. Restorative management means that I am actually managing in a way that social, environmental, and economic resources or capitals are being restored. So not only that I'm using up as much as naturally restores itself, but I'm actually and putting this one back, but I'm actually putting back more than that. So agriculture, for instance, could be one of these, because if you think about agriculture, if you do it in the right way, it naturally captures CO2. So if you think about your CO2 impact as a main aspect of that impact, at the same time, agriculture often is something that people who are economically not very well off, but like a small scale agriculture are doing. So there's an opportunity for social development as well. And at the same time, well, if you're moving away again from the big monocultures, there seems to be also economic impact in there. So if we actually would re-gear that system of food production, well, agriculture might actually become something extremely sustainable. Good. Then if you have neutral impact management, the idea is that, for instance, if you only look at the environmental impact, ecosystems do restore a certain negative impact. So if you have a river delta, for instance, many of the phosphates and other elements of fertilizers that somewhere further upstream have gone into the river are actually being absorbed, cleaned up before they reach the sea, particularly in big river deltas. Through natural processes. So a neutral impact management would be where we are actually having an impact that basically matches that natural absorption capacity of the planet, this natural restoration capacity of the planet. So still we're having a negative impact, but the planet can handle it. And then sustainable management is often what we call the triple bottom line impact that doesn't actually go beyond the planetary restoration capacity overall. And then we would have average unsustainable management. So sustainable management over here is where we still have some kind of negative impact, but going beyond. But average sustainable management is what most people or companies actually claim. They're saying that, yeah, I'm doing all the good stuff. So they're not defining sustainability by the impact, but rather what they're doing. So they might be engaging in best practice of environmental management, but that still doesn't mean necessarily that you're actually ending up with a neutral or even a positive environmental bottom line in this case. So, and then obviously the vast majority still is on that below average unsustainable management, where you're not engaging in the best practices even, and obviously if you're not doing so, also your environmental, social, and economic impact will be below the ones that do. So I think it gives us a little bit more of a nuanced idea of how those different elements of or how we could evaluate different forms of sustainable management. And then talking about evaluating, there's those very interesting and ironic or almost grotesque type of situations. So, for instance, this company that have set up solar power plants to fuel their coal mining operations. Isn't that a very interesting irony? But it's really hard to know what to think about something like this if you don't have tools in order to assess what that actually means. And this is where the life cycle model comes in. It's really, really powerful. And it helps you to split up the different impacts, social, environmental, economic impacts, into different parts of your product or service life cycle. So typically we only, or mostly we only measure the creation part. So our own operations, how many water do we use, how many CO2 do we emit, how many waste do we make, how many accidents do we have in the social dimensions, how many wage do we pay in that value creation part. But this is not all of the impacts. And this is why the life cycle is so important, because you also have to think about the use. So just that somebody else is using your product and makes a mess. So think about cars, for instance, doesn't mean that you're not also co-responsible for that impact. And of course, you also have to think about the end of useful life, so the recycle phase, ideally, if we're able to get that product or that service to a degree where you can still do something with it after the original endpoint has been reached. And you already see there's quite a couple of different ways or things you can do. So you can reuse it as is. You can actually recycle, meaning that you break it down into the smallest elements and you reuse the raw materials again to produce something else. Or, as we still mostly do, is to dispose of it, to throw it away. So this gives us a really neat tool to analyze our different impacts. And here's an example from Samsung Electronics. And you might know that consumer good electronics are some of the most difficult ones to make circular. So circular meaning that you get a closed life cycle where it just gets reused, recycled, reused, recycled, reused, recycled. So there you see why it is so difficult. But what's actually good about this is that we have a very nuanced appreciation of some of the things that happen in different life cycle stages. And this is also shown in most of the big corporations' sustainability reports showing those metrics. So for instance, if you're thinking, okay, what are they doing environmentally in use? Then you see that they're actually claiming that 91% of companies of Samsung's products were classified as eco products, with above average performance and material reduction, energy usage, and toxicity. So toxicity, particularly important when the product breaks down later on in the end of useful lifetime. But the energy usage is really, really crucial for how do you account for what your customers are actually doing. So you're reducing the part of the life, the impact that goes into the use life cycle by building a different product. Levi's jeans, for instance, they had for a long time, they had a very strong education campaign about how to actually wash your jeans, because this is where most of the energy impact comes from in the use stage. So this is really interesting because you can actually account for it and you can work your way through. But it gets a little bit more complex because we could have all of those different ways of accounting depending on where we draw the boundary around what we want to understand. And you see, for instance, you could have only a greenhouse gas emissions footprint only for production, so the environmental. You could have a product water footprint that runs through all of the different stages of the life cycle. You could focus only on the end of use and how much packaging waste you produce. And this is only talking about the environmental part of your bottom line. You see how much more complicated it can get for the other part. So this is really what sustainable management is all about, at least half of it, because the other half is then what do you do about it? And this is something that we won't cover in this chapter because it gets in a very, very nuanced way in every little thing you do, every different function, every department, every product of your business. And this is something that we cover in large proportions of the rest of the book as well. So not only assessing the impact, what we mostly talked about here, but actually managing the impact. I'm not going to bore you with the entire summary, but the big picture idea here is really that sustainable management is about managing those three capitals, social, environmental, economic. We have to find out how our impact in those dimensions actually is. And ideally, we're trying to get to a stage where that impact becomes restorative. If you found that interesting, have a look at the other materials in the book. This is just a snapshot of some of it. Really interesting interview with John Elkin himself, the creator of the Triple Bottom Line. Judy, a really good friend of mine, who can give you an idea about what it means to be somebody who actually focuses on sustainability management and environmental management. A true story, a slightly nasty one, that's why it's anonymized, a very intimate one in the way of somebody who really has a change of mind. And we do have a digging deeper section where you can think more about footprints, and we do have those worksheets in all of the chapters. So all of this is in all of the chapters, not only that chapter 5, where you can use that worksheet to analyze a particular product or an activity. Yeah, so this was just a snapshot. As mentioned, there's much more out there. That kind of word cloud can help you to get an idea what there might be, and maybe you want to look up some of those yourself. So, for instance, you might want to find out what a zero node is. Good. So thank you very much for listening. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. If you're part of the lecture at Ulster University, and if you're not, please do feel free to comment on the video, to like or dislike, and to get in touch. Please feel free to add me on LinkedIn as well. I'm really happy to talk more.